Hey guys, how's it going? Thank you so much for joining us again for our second installation of website security webinars. And so today I want to take some time to talk about how websites get hacked. A little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Tony Perez. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO here at Sucuri, and I work in connection with my partner Daniel, who's the technical visionary here and our CTO, and kind of dictates a lot of what we do and how we build things. And him and the technical team kind of spend day in, day out working with our customers and working with communities around the world on various technologies, trying to understand what's happening, how are they happening, and then our biz side and our marketing side, we're responsible for trying to convey that in a way that's absorbable. So to do that, we've set up these webinars. And so this webinar specifically, we're going to talk about how these attacks are occurring, at least what we believe to be the cause of them based on our research. This talk is going to be for those that maybe are currently infected, maybe those that have been infected, but they always have the same kind of question, the burning question in their mind of, how did this happen? I don't understand. Why did this happen to me? We won't get into so much of the why, but we'll get into the how and try to better understand how attackers function, and then understanding how they function actually helps us prepare and improve our own security posture. At least that's our belief. So with that, for those that joined us last time, this might be a little bit of a review, but our last conversation we talked about the impacts of compromises, specifically what that means to us as an organization or as website owners, and things that we should be on the lookout for. So we talked about 7 main infection types or actions that an attacker may take once they've successfully compromised your environment. With things like malware distribution is probably the number one thing, right? You know, distribute malware, drive-by downloads, hidden trojans, things like that. Try to affect the audience, try to affect the people that are coming to you. We also talked a lot about search engine poisoning and the effects of that, especially as more businesses go online that are heavily reliant on their websites. SEO is very, very important, and SEP attacks are one mechanism that attackers use to abuse that. But we also kind of started to flirt a little bit with things like phishing lures and ransomware and defacements. So if you haven't, I encourage you to go back and take a look at our previous webinar, because we go into these a little bit more in depth. And the whole objective was to help you understand why we need to be looking at security and why there's so much conversation on what can attackers do. We also talked specifically about the impacts, and we divided them into just 2 distinct groups, right? We talked about the business implications of them. So what does that mean to your brand? We also talked about the economic impacts of that. What happens if your website goes down and now you are no longer able to generate revenue or lead generation or something along those lines. And then, of course, the overall emotional distress, the attachment we have with our online properties, and what happens when we no longer have that access. We then moved into the technical side, right? What happens when, what are we talking about when we talk about website blacklisting? What does that really mean, the various service providers out there? We talked about, of course, the SEO impacts and the impacts to your visitors. Obviously, these are very high-level impacts, but these are perhaps what I feel and what we feel to be like the top 6 issues that website owners are faced with. So this is all really, really interesting, right? Okay, now we understand what they can do, but they didn't answer the how. We didn't answer specifically on the hacks themselves. And so that's what we want to do here in this conversation. Today, there are about a little bit over 1 billion websites in the market as of last night's check, right? And continue to grow. And as technology continues to expand and the proliferation of technology and open source CMSs, we're seeing this evolution. And so of that 1 billion plus websites, we see about 33% of them are powered by CMS websites. I mean, that's a pretty impressive number, and growing dramatically as these open source technologies continue to kind of change the landscape of website development and business development and pushing online presences. 73% of those 33% are made up of these 4 CMSs, right? WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, and Magento. And that continues to grow as they continue to evolve and develop and expand their exposure. And so the challenge I normally see when I'm talking to website owners, however, is that we think in singularities, right? So we think, oh, okay, I'm learning WordPress, I'm learning Joomla, and that's my specific domain. But the thing is that the environment is a lot more complex than that, right? When we talk about the CMS itself, it's but one piece of it's one cog in a wheel, right? And our attack surface is actually a lot larger than this, right? When we talk about the applications themselves, the WordPresses, Joomlas, the application has other environments. Right? We have things like administrative panels. We have other applications on the server itself that aren't part of the website, but still count as part of our attack service. And that's just within our one domain of applications. We have multiple domains, and I've break it down into 4 distinct ones when talking specifically to website owners, right? A lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to the environmental considerations or environmental domain, right? What's going on in your local machine? Do you have desktops? There are Trojans out there designed to scrape information from your local environment, things like credentials to your financial solutions, to your social media outlets, to your websites. They're designed to look for those things. One very easy way of doing it are the Trojans that target specifically your FTP clients, for instance. A lot of folks will save their username and password in the domains within their FTP clients, and those Trojans are designed to identify them, identify who the host is, identify what the website is, username and password, send that off to a CNC. Or things like public Wi-Fi, man-in-the-middle attacks, working in a public location like airports, things like that. And it's kind of why we've seen this proliferation of HTTPS, right? Secure the communication between point A and point B. And so then we also talk about things on the server side, things like the OS on the server, things like the programming languages or the server daemons, FTP, SFTP, things like that. All those are consideration. Then there's, of course, the infrastructure. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say that on the infrastructure side or just across the surface, there are certain things that you are responsible for as a website owner, and then there are things that your service providers are responsible for, right? But the key here is that there is a responsibility shared between yourself and your website. It's not one of those things. It's contrary to what you might hear. Oh, it's a quick install. Plug and play. Just configure it, deploy it in your site. It's the complete opposite, right? And actually, we do ourselves a disservice when we say that, because it's not a matter of just deploying it. We have to sustain it. We have to maintain it. We have to continue to look at things like security and make it part of our discussions. And so when we look at the domain specifically, here's a little bit more detailed breakdown, right? So on the environmental side, we're looking at things like public Wi-Fi, like I mentioned, or insecure networks, even at home, or in trusted networks like in the office. You have your end users around poor administration and maintenance, right? End users are a critical piece to your overall security posture, and yet we rarely look at ourselves and say, okay, what are we doing to ensure that we don't get hacked? How are we addressing this? On the application side, of course, you have the CMS, but you also have all the non-CMS applications. And you also have the custom applications that still have the same vulnerabilities, right? And maybe play into targeted-based attacks more than opportunistic-based attacks, but there's still things that we have to consider. On the server side, right, if we're running VPSs or dedicated environments, we're responsible for those operating systems. We're responsible for the programming language or the daemons we have enabled. But if we're on a shared host, maybe some of that responsibility is on your host. And so we have to have that conversation with the host to say, hey, what are you running, and is it current, and what is your mechanisms in place to ensure that you're staying current and evolving as these patches are made available? What is that protocol? It's okay to ask that question. Most of the best hosts out there will have an answer for you and say, this is our protocol, this is what we do, and this is how we do it. And then, of course, in the infrastructure, leveraging good, trusted sources to ensure they're providing the right service. Now, and I'll talk a little bit why that's important here in a second. And it's so in security, we have this comment on the security chain, right? And so when I look at the website domain, I think, okay, this is the security chain involves all these pieces, right? And what is supposed to describe this chain is that any piece in that, if you think of a chain, you break one link, the entire chain falls apart. And so when we think of security, we can't think in terms of singularities, right? These are not mutually exclusive environments. These are all interconnected. And so we think, okay, if I'm running a website, regardless of the technology or that it's been built in a custom manner, you have to be responsible for the other pieces. And maybe somebody else's, right? Maybe you're a large enterprise and you have a security operations center or a network operations center, but maybe you are an enterprise of one, and you don't necessarily understand all the different pieces, but you need to have a way of asking the questions, okay, if I'm accessing this environment is critical for me, how am I doing that, right? Where does this environment sit? Okay, it sits on a host. What does a host mean? What does the host providing me? Is it a shared environment versus a VPS? And then what about my host? How is my host addressing security? A lot of people misunderstand the host relationship in your website, right? So the host is responsible for the security of their network, not necessarily the security of your website, because they hand that off to you. But a lot of people don't think about that or don't have that dialogue. So it's all interconnected, and we have to be aware of this. With this understanding of our environments, let's look specifically at the types of attacks, because I like to break them down into two very specific ones, and this is something that I've come up with. This is just something that it's known in the security space, right? And in the market that we're in of website security, of just generic website security, is you have targeted attacks and you have attacks of opportunity. I hate to break it to folks, but most of us are not special enough to be classified on the targeted attacks, right? And most of us fall into the realm of targets of opportunity, right? We're the low-hanging fruit. We fail to update. Maybe we run the latest version or the oldest version of TimTom, and because we use it for image manipulation, and we still have it on our server. Or maybe we don't use it, but we left it on there, right? We have this bad tendency to leave these soup kitchen servers where we throw everything into the kitchen sink and we just kind of leave it there. And oh, well, I'm not using it. Well, it doesn't mean that it's no longer accessible, right? It's still there. And so we fall into this realm of targets of opportunity, right? Scanners going out there, identifying these issues. Oh, you have it, great. Let me penetrate. On the targeted side, it's very different. It actually happens very rarely, and the motivations are different, right? There's enough incentive for me to focus on one target and identify how I'm going to penetrate that environment. Because the return's bigger. You know, a classic example of this is an attack of opportunity might be a mom and pop running, a bakery shop, right? There's really no incentive other than just happen to be there and they're running the wrong version of something. A targeted attack might be something like in 2012 when NBC was compromised and they were distributing both malware and spam on a conditional basis, right? It was only up for about 4 hours, but in those 4 hours, they had the opportunity to infect millions and millions of website owners, you know? It's a really big issue, and skill levels obviously differentiate. You know, obviously it could be around, it could be competition, it could just be hatred. You see this a lot in the religious sector. You know, you have a church promoting one thing, and then another religion attacking that church because of that, or a church attacking something. It happens all the time. Well, it happens seldomly, relatively speaking, in terms of the scale of attacks we see. On the attacks of opportunity, remember that it's personal, right? It's the modus operandi for website attacks is attack as many people as possible for mass exposure, maximum return. And if you just happen to be there, you happen to be there and you get affected. Now we move in kind of the attack sequence or the attack flow. What does it work? And if you look at a high level how these attacks happen, they all kind of follow a very similar model. So for one, we talked about how targets of opportunity are highly automated, right? We talked about they happen about 99% of the time. So how do they achieve that? They achieve that through automation, right? Automation is very efficient, very effective. It allows them to have greater impact. What it also allows them to do is be much faster to the draw. So we saw this a few years ago with the severe SQL injection vulnerability that led to an RCE in Drupal, for instance. And they said, okay, if you didn't patch within, 8, 12 hours, whatever that number was, consider yourself affected. That was an example of how fast these attacks can occur, and it's facilitated through automation and the interconnected web that we live in, right? And so when we dive into this attack sequences, for instance, they kind of follow this 6 steps in some combination, right? You know, there's this reconnaissance phase, identification, there's the actual exploitation itself, there's some level of sustainment, there's the actual compromise, and then of course there's some level of cleanup. But it's not the same across targeted and opportunistic. When we look at reconnaissance, for instance, we talked about, on the target side, we talked about, hey, I want to specifically focus on you as an organization or as an individual. And so I don't necessarily know how I'm going to penetrate your environment. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to exploit you, but I want to see what's happening, right? What ports are being opened? What platform are you using? What plugins do you have available? And let me see kind of what I can find. And then on the targeted side, you kind of then move into this identification phase, right? Okay, all right, they're running WordPress, WordPress 3.0, but they're running the Revslayer plugin, so and maybe they're running Gravity Forms, and I know that there's two major vulnerabilities in those 2 plugins, and so they're running the right version, so that I'm identifying what I'm going to happen, right? So the targeted attack is a little bit different. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get in there, but I'm going to identify what that's going on, and then I'm going to proceed with my exploitation. On the opportunistic side, it's a little bit different, right? I'm going into the attack with an understanding of what I want. In 2014, we had a big discussion on Revslayer. So by being able to scan the entire web, my reconnaissance identification phase occurring at the same time. And in some instances, identification goes ahead of time. So I say, okay, I'm going to target Revslayer, and so now I want to scan the entire internet or the entire web and figure out anybody that's running this version of Revslayer at this version. And then if you fall into that list, then I already know I've done my reconnaissance and my identification at the same time, right? So on the targeted side, I don't necessarily know how I'm going to penetrate an environment, and I'm interested in an individual. On the opportunistic side, I'm scanning everybody based on something that I know is there, that I want to exploit. I really don't care who they are or what they do. It's neither here or there. And then they both go into this exploitation phase. Once I've identified what the exploitation is or what the issue is I want to exploit, I proceed with actually performing the exploitation. Am I successful? Once that success is achieved, it's a matter of, okay, all right, I'm in. What am I going to do? And usually this kind of goes into sustainment phase. This is where attackers will go in and install their backdoors or other means of ensuring that they can retain access once the compromise is complete. So they go in, they install their backdoors, they put them in remote locations, they put them in areas where they don't suspect you identifying where they're at. On the targeted side, it's a little bit more it can be more automated, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And then on the automated side, it's more, they're just dropping everything in there. They're dropping backdoors, anything that gives them access. And then the actual compromise, right? What was my objective? Did I want to do some form of data exfiltration? You know, what we normally see on targeted attacks, you think things like Target, Home Depot, things like that. It's very targeted. My interest is stealing that information, stealing credit card information. On the opportunistic side, you know, am I looking just to simply distribute malware? Am I looking to use it as part of a DDoS campaign, part of my botnet? Or am I looking to do all of the above, right? You know, a few years ago, it was about doing one objective. These days, on the opportunistic side, is throw everything in the kitchen sink at the problem and let's just see what sticks, do everything. And then on the cleanup is more not necessarily you as a website owner, but as the attacker of how do I ensure that I reduce the potential for detection? How do I cover my tracks? And that's more the targeted side. We see some of it on the opportunistic side, but very, very seldomly. And, you know, in this instance, we don't care if we get detected. It's just about mass exposure. One thing I wanted to kind of provide is a way to think about this, way from a security perspective, right? This seems like a lot of information. You're like, how am I supposed to address this? And what I always tell my teams is like, okay, you can't eat a sandwich without chewing, right? So focus on each individual phase and then ask yourselves, do I have the right answer for this, right? So from a reconnaissance standpoint, how am I reducing that attack surface? How am I ensuring that they're not going to find things? Am I, you know, disabling? You hear a lot of like security through obscurity kind of discussion on this side, like, oh, well, we don't want them to find our WP admin or admin CP or whatever the case may be. We don't want them to know what version of a CMS that I'm running, so you disable that. But it's also at the server level, right? What daemons am I running? What ports are available? Should I have FTP open if I'm only using SSH? Things like that. On the identification side, you know, what vulnerabilities exist. On the enterprise side, we talk a lot about vulnerability management programs, right? We don't talk a lot about that on the consumer, mid-market domain, right? It's not a common terminology. We talk a lot about update, which is really kind of patch management. Updates are there to address a number of things, from security fixes to bugs, things like that. Not every bug is a security fix. And so, you know, we say update because it's easier for people to absorb, and you know, it falls into this kind of patch management domain. But vulnerability management program is really kind of what we're talking about. We're updating not only to fix issues, but also to address a lot of security issues. And from a security perspective, we're interested in. So how do we know that exists, right? On the enterprise side, they employ scanners, right? You know, for non-CMS applications, you have things like Nessus or W3AF, things like that are designed to go and look, hey, do I have weaknesses? Do I have things like SQL injection or cross-site scripting or other similar vulnerabilities in my code from the remote perspective, right? On the CMS side, fortunately, we have a lot of CMS-specific standards. We have things like WP Scan and Joomla Scan and CMS Scan and Drupal Scan and things like that that are designed for specific CMSs, and then CMSs as a whole. They better understand how the CMSs are built, and they better know how to manipulate the objects to see if they can't find some form of vulnerability. Why not integrate that into your posture, right? But you have to be very sensitive here. You can't just deploy it, or you have a lot of like false negatives or false positives, and it can create a lot of noise. So you want to make sure you're working with your developer on that. Exploitation. So we've gone through the process of reducing our potential attack surface. We've implemented controls to figure out ways to reduce or identify potential vulnerabilities that others are going to be looking for. But we understand that nothing we do will be 100%. So how are we addressing that, right? So how are we mitigating these exploitation attempts? And in some instances, when working with vulnerabilities, there's a lot of components to it. It's not, oh, I can't just look at this and say, oh, he didn't validate his input, or oh, he didn't sanitize his output. No, sometimes it's a combination of bugs together that create a vulnerability. So how are you ensuring that you're implementing the tools to do that? And some controls these days is employment of things like website firewalls or intrusion prevention systems designed to help more proactively mitigate these attacks. They're not the easy button, right? They're not the silver bullet that we've all been wanting for, but they help reduce your risk posture and your overall security posture dramatically. Then there's the sustainment piece. You know, we know that when they go through this phase, if they are successful, they're going to do some form of sustainment activity. How do we know what's happening in that edge, right? How do we know if backdoors are in there? backdoors don't present themselves external. They present themselves on the back end and don't necessarily present themselves. You have to know what you're looking for. So, are you employing intrusion detection systems of any kind, right? Things that are looking for integrity changes, addition of files. Are you being aware of what's happening in your environment? A lot of this, as a website owner, you know these things. Oh, wow, this file doesn't belong. Wow, where did this plugin come from, right? These things should be indicators of a potential issue. And then the actual compromise. How do you know if you're compromised, right? The most recent study is going out right now from the enterprise down to the small mom and pop is most people just don't know that they're compromised until they've been notified of it, until the network feels the pressure, they lost $80 million, or whatever the case may be, or they've been blacklisted by Google, right? Depending on who you are as an organization. And then, of course, on the cleanup side, right? Auditing gets a bad rap, or logging gets a bad rap, right? People just don't like to do it, but it's important, right? Logging provides you, it's the solution, it's the one mechanism you have in place to help you in the event of all failure, right? You want to understand how this happened, how did they get in, and what did they penetrate? Because I would imagine that most of us just don't want it to happen again, right? If it happens one time, shame on us, right? After that, let's figure out what happened and let's improve our controls, right? None of these controls tell you that you will never get compromised. They just tell you that you can address them and not be that low-hanging fruit and not be part of that. Make it just that much harder for the attackers to penetrate your environment. There's one attack that isn't necessarily compromising your environment. It targets your availability. By availability, I mean the accessibility of your site to your audience, right? So, someone types in your domain and they want some information back, right? What we're seeing is, a slow growth in things like denial of service attacks or distributed denial of service attacks. They're not necessarily, the intent is different, right? When we look at traditional hacks, the hacks are designed to, I want to compromise this environment and my intent is to do something with this environment. When we're looking at availability attacks, what we're talking about is, I really could care less about your audience and I can really care less about doing anything in your environment. I just want to make sure that your site is not available. And I will blackmail you, I will force you to pay me some ransom, and I will continue to attack your site and overwhelm your resources. And in some instances, it's not that complicated, right? Especially as we see this evolution of denial of service attacks on things like layer 7, inundating your environment with HTTP requests of some kind, to the point where it saturates the network, and maybe your host comes in and says, you know what, I'm sorry, you're on a shared box. I just can't afford you to be in our environment anymore because you're having residual effects across my entire network, and they kick you out. And all of a sudden now your website that you're most dependent on is up. So it's not necessarily a hack where they compromise the environment, but it's a hack in where they can bring down the availability of your site, which can have, of course, adverse effects on you and your business. So that's great, right? So we went over the environmental considerations. We went over the sequence or the flow of attacks. Now let's talk about the specific vectors. And when I talk about vectors, I break it down into 5 distinct domains, right? Access control, vulnerabilities, cross-site contamination, third-party integrations, and of course hosting. And I'm going to talk about each one of them here in a second. So on the access control side, I think I like to use this term, and some people are like, oh no, people don't understand that. I like to think that people are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And so I like to use the proper terms, right? Access control around authentication and authorization. Does somebody have access to gain entry into a specific area, right? So if you're working on a CMS, they all have administrative panels. How are you securing that? How are you ensuring and looking at that and saying, I have the right people accessing it from the right locations, and not allowing people to get in? But it extends beyond that, right? We just talked about the environmental considerations in the overall chain. How are we doing that on the server itself, right? How are we doing that on the hosting administrator panel? How are we doing it things like FTP and SFTP and SSH, right? All those are access mechanisms to get into your environment. So it does no good if I secure my CMS but do nothing to the neighboring applications. They're all going to the same location. They're just multiple doors. So we need to look at that. And the same thing applies when you have multiple sites, right? This is a big challenge with the way that hosts are configured today, right? They allow you to create one account, and in that account you can install 100 domains to your blue in the face. Well, somebody goes in and you secure one website, but you don't secure any of the other websites, and then you don't address the access control issue, and that becomes a hodgepodge for issues for you in the future. The attacks specifically against this are what we would consider to be brute force attacks, and they're very rudimentary attacks. They've been around for a very long time, but they're very effective as well, which is why we continue to see them. And it's just, it's a combination of guesses between username and password, trying to find the right combination. And the challenge today, though, is that it's not as random as we may think, because there's so many lists available from some of the major compromises that occurred in 2012, 14, 16, in which these large databases of username and passwords. And the fact is that they depend on human nature, right? Human nature is we use the same username and password across all our platforms. Why? Because we as humans can't remember, and we fail to use things like LastPass or password managers. And so we try to remember it, and we say, okay, I'm going to use the same password across all my domains. Well, use it in LinkedIn, that gets compromised, and now they can access all your information, right? And it's just a matter of finding the right combination. But when I talk about priorities, when I talk about, if one is more important than the other, I think the one that's most important, at least to me and to us, is the exploitation of vulnerabilities, right? Again, though, attackers take advantage of what they expect human nature to be, where we just don't naturally want to help ourselves. And so when we see an update, well, we can't update it, or it might be a challenge of, well, we updated, it might break, it might have a conflict, things like that. And attackers understand that, right? When we look at software vulnerabilities, we're talking specifically about bugs in code, right? And sometimes there's security issues, and they're very blatant, like, okay, wow, that piece of code is not doing the proper sanitization or validation. And so we can expect something like a cross-site scripting attack, or we can expect something like a SQL injection attack. But sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? Maybe sometimes it's abusing an arbitrary kind of a file upload vulnerability of some kind, and then using that to do a remote code execution, using that to do something else, or maybe it's just tying two bugs together, allow me to do one thing, or maybe the vulnerabilities extend beyond the application and go to the server. So a bug in the application and a bug in the server will create one vulnerability, right? And it's this daisy chaining of events or daisy chaining of bugs that allow us to create a security vulnerability that we can then later exploit. I encourage everybody to become familiar with OWASP, with the Open Web Application Security Project. They do a really good job about every 3 years sitting down and trying to understand what they consider to be the top 10 issues affecting websites. They actually have about, I think, 256 different types of vulnerabilities. I may be wrong on that number. It's been a while since I looked at it, but they do offer a lot of great recommendations on like cheat sheets on cross-site scripting or cheat sheets on SQL injection. It's not designed to be the all-encompassing, but for someone starting out from a development standpoint, they can start looking at that. And just even as website owners, just to be familiar with the potential vulnerabilities and what they occur. Why? Because vulnerabilities have always been there. Vulnerabilities are not going away, right? Vulnerabilities are because we as humans introduce errors into how we do things, and that's just natural. And so we can't say, oh, I want code or I want a plugin that has no vulnerabilities. You're already thinking about it incorrectly, right? You're never going to get that. And if anybody ever tells you with our application you'll have no vulnerabilities, that's completely incorrect. That just means nobody's found it yet. And this is specifically rampant right now in CMS applications, not because they're more or less insecure than anything else. It's just because there's more interest in researching that and identifying vulnerabilities because the impacts are much greater. If we took a look at targets of opportunity, if I can look at anybody running on WordPress specific version or Joomla specific version, it's a lot easier for me, and the potential for impact is greater, and the potential for return is greater as well. So when I talk about access control and I talk about software vulnerabilities, I'm talking specifically about external attacks or hacks and how they happen, right? When I talk about cross-site contamination, however, I'm talking more about internal hacks. And what cross-site contamination refers to is the lateral movement that occurs, right? So in large enterprises, I penetrate the perimeter and I can laterally move across the network, identify other networks, devices, servers, things like that. Now take that, reduce that, and focus specifically in the web environment or the web server, right? So I penetrate your account, shared account. You have 100 different servers, 100 different websites within that account. I can then now laterally move across those environments. And maybe they're all on the same platform, but maybe you have multiple different platforms. So maybe you have a WordPress install for your blog and another WordPress install for your main site, but maybe you have a store and you're using Magento, or maybe you're using WooCommerce, whatever the case is. So you secure one environment, but you don't secure the other environment. And so using one environment to penetrate the environment, I can now laterally move across the rest of the environment to identify other weaknesses. And maybe I want to target your main website or whatever the case, or just target any website in there in the environment. It's often the contributing factor for reinfections, right? And this is kind of where you hear things like permissions and default prefixes and stuff like that. This is actually kind of where it comes. That those necessarily lead to external attacks. Those are more configuration issues that lead to internal attacks through the form of something like cross-site contamination. Third-party integrations. We don't talk about this enough, and I think we should, because it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem, especially when we talk about the integration of ad networks into our environments. there's a concept of known as malvertising, and malvertising is, malware and advertising kind of mesh together because that's how creative we are in the security world. And what it refers to is just abusing these ad networks, right? So ad networks are based on trust. So I'm going to go to this network because I trust that they're going to serve me up the right ads. Well, attackers understand that, right? This concept of own one, own them all, right? If I can attack the ad network and embed my payload within the actual image of the malware, I know that it's going to rotate through your site or some site at some point. I really don't care which sites they go through as long as it captures that image. And the problem with this is that a lot of website owners will get very irate. They're like, I don't understand. I've been infected. I can see it. I was blacklisted, but nobody can find it. They go to security provider, that doesn't find it. They use the latest plugin or extension, that doesn't find it. And they're going crazy. I rebuilt it, it doesn't happen. But come to find out, they have 3 different ad networks coming through their environment. And the payload is highly, highly conditional. It makes it very, very challenging to identify. I mean, I'm not joking about that. It's sometimes it could show up once a day. Maybe it shows up once per IP or IP range. Maybe it shows up per geography. Right? And so all these configurations have to be taken into consideration to try to identify something. So malvertising is something that continues to grow, continues to be a problem. We've seen it affect some of the largest brands in the world, and it affects some of the smallest brands as well, right? It's something we need to be thinking about. And so when we're talking to integrators, we need to be asking the question, well, what are your security postures? What is your protocol for potential malware issues? And if you are running ad networks in your site, you need to be asking yourself, okay, if I have an issue, could it be my ad network? And if it's so, how do I know that? How do I define that? Let's remove it for a second. Let's see what happens. And then hosting. Now, hosting gets really bad rap, right? It's been a long time since we've seen mass compromises in hosting. And so a lot of people actually get it wrong. They say, oh, it was my host's fault. It actually isn't, and it is, right? The problem with the hosting world right now is that it's so saturated. It's so easy to get online. It's so easy to push a new website saying, I'm a host. We also have a challenge in which we have hosts that aren't really hosts, right? We have a marketing company that wants to provide an all-inclusive white label solution to their customer. And so they'll spin up a little AWS instance and they'll say, hey, I am now a host for my customers. Yet they don't know their elbow from their rear on how to manage that environment. So they have a little AWS server, they misconfigure it, they have no staff on hand to help support, but the website owner is completely unaware of that, right? They just say, well, they're hosting it, they're offering it, I'm trusting them, they must know what they're doing, but that doesn't necessarily happen. And so we have these inexperienced service providers that are actually adding confusion to the hosting marketplace. And as long as you stay to more reputable, larger organizations, you should be okay. The way I like to kind of use an analogy for this is it's like me going to my car wash guy and saying, hey, can you change out the transmission in my car? And the car wash guy's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of mechanical, I can do it, right? And he changes out your transmission, right? And he's like, oh, now I'm gonna offer this full inclusive car service where I'll wash your car and change your transmission. It's a little bit dire, but you hopefully get the point, right? Each of these things, just like you go to a marketing person, just like you go to a development shop or an SEO shop, hosting, security, things are things that you need to be taken into consideration, and serious consideration, if you're gonna go live and depend on your website. And it's actually one of the leading causes for crossing contamination, right? These insecure hosts don't know how to configure these environments, so one neighboring site that doesn't even fall within your account has the potential to affect all your websites just because of improper deployment, improper configuration. So with that, we talked about all these different things, right? We talked about the environment, we talked about attack flow sequence, things like that. So what are we supposed to make sense of this? So when I do this, I always like to add this section here on website security. It's not a static state, right? We're always looking for the easy button. It's like, hey, just tell me what I have to do. Tell me the top 10 things I need to do. The problem is that it doesn't exist in security, right? It's a continuous process. It's an evolution, right? That the landscape continues to evolve, and we have to stay ahead of that. And if you're not willing to do that, then you need to leverage something that will do that for you if you depend on your website for anything. And so I like to think about it in like these 5 domains, right? You need to be thinking about it for how do I protect my environment, but I know that protection is never 100%. So how do I detect? How do I know what's happening and the potential of something happening? And if something does happen, how do I know that? And then, of course, what is my response plan? Like, am I going to address it? Is my host going to address it? A lot of website owners don't realize that hosts don't necessarily address your security issues. They'll either charge you more, they'll disable your site, they'll kick you out of their network, and then all of a sudden that adds to that emotional distress that I originally talked about. Like, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? And then basic things like maintenance. Maintenance and best practices is something that is already known in the security space, but unfortunately in the domains that we operate, aren't necessarily, right? Too many people are creating websites. They don't understand the basics of how do I administer a site, how do I employ, proper patch management or update sequences, things like that, or how do I employ things like least privilege? Instead of giving everybody admin, give people only a few people admin. And I'll get into more conversation on this in the future in another webinar. The other challenge I find is that we often look at technology as the end-all be-all, but it's but one piece of our approach, right? Security has always been made up of people, process, and technology. Technology by itself is dumb, right? Okay, I buy a firewall, I implement it in my network, but I don't configure it, and I leave the default admin as username and password. Well, I just installed a very expensive appliance in my network, or maybe I purchase a plugin and I install the plugin, but I do none of the configuration components in that, right? What good is that? No, it's a combination. The people get the technology, they deploy it, and then they configure it based on your environment. And there's no single blueprint. There's no configuration that works for everybody. Every website's a little bit different. And then we have a process for that. How do we check it? How do we stay on it? Okay, we're seeing attacks. Do we need to evolve it? Do we need to change it? What do we need to do to ensure that we're staying ahead of it? And it's a continuous process. And then lastly, I just like to tell folks, just like we go to hosting providers or marketing folks or SEO folks, security just isn't a DIY project. It never has been. This is a difficult concept for a lot of folks to understand, especially in open source communities where it's all about, we can figure it out. But the challenge is that it changes too fast. It works. It's too many things happening to stay ahead of. As you can tell, just from this very, very short, truncated version of how websites get hacked. So with that, again, my name is Tony. I'm with Sucuri. What we offer here is specifically on the protection, detection, response domain. We leverage a defensive depth kind of approach where we understand there's no one piece by itself that is the ideal solution, but it's a combination of things. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kristen, and if there are any questions, I'll open it up.
We have a lot of questions, actually. So one of the first ones we'll let you respond to. WordPress website utilizes Sucuri's Cloud Proxy website firewall. Is there any need for me to install another security plugin like iThings Security Pro or WordFence?
So it's a very good question, right? I wrote an article a few months back talking about the plugin ecosystem. Our services are designed to be all-encompassing for a website owner, and what ends up happening, at least in our experience, is when you start introducing multiple technologies to different vendors, everybody uses a little bit of a different approach, and what it could potentially introduce is confusion. So we may identify each other's files as issues, and so all of a sudden there's a lot of false positives, false negatives type stuff going on. If you're using one, I would say no. If you're using our products were designed so that you wouldn't have to, right? Our free Sucuri WordPress plugin is designed to give you visibility and auditing of what's going on in the environment. It serves a very different function than our other product services. So if you're using our services, I would say that there wouldn't be a need to use any of the other ones because we're looking at the entire scope of your website attack surface, the best that we can that fits within our domain, within the security domain. And it could actually introduce a lot of conflicts. It won't hurt you, of course, but if you're technical and you can understand what's happening, like, oh no, that's a false positive, etc., that's great. But if you want to make security part of your everyday, no problem. But if you want to put security to the side and say, look, these guys handle it, work with one vendor, work with one service provider, and you should be good to go.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions come in regards to brute force attacks. So what's the best way to combat those?
So, brute force is an interesting issue, right? We see this evolution in attacks, right? It used to be that I can just attack WP admin or admin CP or administrator and just direct attack. But now, a few months back, Daniel wrote an article, a really good article on amplification through XMRPC, where they can embed multiple attacks within one request, right? Hundreds, if not thousands of requests at the same time. That actually amplifies their ability to do that. So it's very challenging. I like to do two different things when it comes to brute force, right? The first is allow known goods, right? So I do a lot of IP whitelisting. So I only access my WP admin, for instance, by known IPs. That's the only people that can access it. So if you go to Perez box WP admin right now, you'll see that you always get blocked immediately. So boom, right off the bat, I don't have to worry about those attacks coming in. I understand that isn't necessarily the best course of action for a lot of folks. So a very easy way to address this is doing some form of multi-factor authentication on the WP admin, right? Things that will kill the request as it's coming in and never even reaches it. So those are two of the approaches that you can leverage to address that.
Okay.
It's a no-sum game if you're trying to do IP blacklisting. I'll just say that right now, right? The IPs rotate too fast, they're happening too often, it becomes your full-time job just trying to stay up with it. I guess that's my point.
All right. Next question. Is hosting on your own website on a Windows server safe?
It's a weird question, right? I don't know how secure is your Windows environment, right? It's not to say that Windows isn't secure, but if you know how to administer Windows and how to secure it, there's a lot of websites running on IIS, but they're managed by system administrators that know how to run it. So I guess the question I would have back is, I don't know, are you a system administrator? Have you configured your web server to be secure? Do you do appropriate tests against it? Are you doing all the best practices on that Windows server? If so, then it should be just fine, right? Just the same as a Linux box. But the chances are that you're not doing it correctly or it's not deployed correctly, and it could create issues for you. And some applications are built better for different environments, right? So take that into consideration.
All right. Another question. Many of us are using a third-party service for email campaigns, SEO, etc. What's your advice for those types of environments?
So repeat that question one more time. Using third-party services for different functions, like
Right, for emails, SEO, just those types of functions. What's your advice for securing those environments?
yeah, so that's a challenge, right? So things like for personally, I like to use Google Apps the best I can. It's cheap enough as a business. I trust Google, right? It comes down to trust when it comes to leveraging third-party services. It's very relative, very subjective to provide recommendations without fully testing it. So I use Google Apps, so I leverage them, and I would try to just say, try to go with the more reputable, well-known, larger entity when it comes to this stuff, right? If you go with a new player, that's great, you can do that, but understand that if they're trying to go live, there's probably going to be some shortcuts being cut. But it's really hard to answer that question without specific scenarios.
Okay,
Uh,
we'll do one more and then we'll switch over to Twitter. So would you speak to injection attacks and how Sucuri can be used to protect that attack vector?
Yeah, so there's different forms of injection attacks, right? Cross-site scripting itself is a form of an injection attack. Then you have the more traditional kind of SQL injection, things like that. So the way Sucuri works is we offer a perimeter defense to your website, and we function at the edge. So it's an application, it's a website firewall, the Sucuri firewall, which functions as an intrusion prevention system. And what we do is we look at all the incoming requests to your website and strip them. So if we look at how injections work, they're traditionally embedded within the URL themselves. They're trying to abuse things. And so we can see that as it's coming into the network, and we strip it out of the attack sequence so that only the benign traffic gets to your server. So those attacks actually never penetrate our edge, never get to your server. So that's how we mitigate those injection attacks. So we do a lot of that through a lot of virtual patching, a lot of virtual hardening is what we call it at the edge.
All right, so that was our last question. Again, we want to thank everyone for their participation. We have documented all the questions that have been asked in this webinar session, so we're going to transfer over to Twitter. If you have any news once we close this webinar out, please use the hashtag #AskSucuri, but Tony's going to get started right away in answering the remaining questions from this session. Don't forget to complete the survey that's going to pop up on your screen, and we will send out information regarding our next webinar soon. Thank you all for participating. Have a great